But titignan po natin kung ano mangyayari during that time. Medyo speculative pa po kasi yun eh.
President Marcos nominates a former administrator of the Light Rail Transit Authority, or LRTA, as general manager of the Philippine Charity Sweepstakes Office, or PCSO. The palace says Mel Robles has been credited as the only administrator who made the LRTA profitable. Robles is currently a businessman engaged in real estate. Up to 2 million families could be delisted from the government's Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino program, or the 4Ps. Social Welfare Secretary Erwin Tulfo says some families no longer deserve to be part of the Conditional Cash Transfer Program. The agency is cleansing the list of 4Ps beneficiaries upon the order of President Marcos. As of the first quarter, 4.2 million households are active members.
We have identified 1.3 families or household na nakalagay na sa non-poor section. Nakakatayo na yun sa sarili nilang mga paa. Tapos yung mga anak nila maaring nag-graduate na. We're still working another 600 pa. So baka umabot ito ng 2 million. We have to delist kasi nga yung ibang problema hindi na namin makita kung saan sila. Yung iba naman ay ayaw kaming pagbuksan.
A group of 4Ps beneficiaries questions the government's statement that many families under the program are not poor. The Samahan na Nagkakaisang Pamilya ng Pantawid says households go through a lengthy process to prove they are qualified. Under the program, a family could get 500 to 1,400 pesos a month or up to 15,000 pesos a year. Budget Secretary Amena Pangandaman clarifies the proposed right-sizing in government does not necessarily mean a reduction of employees. Pangandaman says the government is looking at strengthening the requirements for agencies, though it has yet to pinpoint which offices will undergo right-sizing. A labor group has opposed the proposal, which could affect thousands of workers. It says this was opposite or opposed to President Marcos's campaign promise of filling up thousands of plantilla positions in government.
Top-heavy ang government, di po ba? May secretary, may ilan na undersecretaries, may ilan na assistant secretaries, may ilan pala mga consultants. Yan po muna siguro ang tingnan nila. Hindi kami na maliliit lang ng mga kawani at manggagawa ng gobyerno.
Ang right sizing po sinasabi niya eh. Hindi ang ibig sabihin nito ay dapat bawasan mo ang mga kawani. Ang right sizing, ang ibig sabihin niyan ay ilapat mo ang sapat na numero at yung kwalipikadong tao sa gobyerno para maging mas mahusay ang governance at delivery ng public service.
Labor officials say they will carefully study the proposal. The budget chief said right-sizing will help the government save at least 14.8 billion pesos per year. Vice President and Education Secretary Sara Duterte remains firm about opening the upcoming school year in August, despite calls to suspend it. Preparations now underway for the return to face-to-face classes in November. Jason Nadalo has that and other education updates.
All hands on deck as the Education Department pushes through with the opening of classes on August 22nd. Vice President and Education Secretary Sara Duterte says she is ready to hold dialogues with different groups, but the government could no longer delay the resumption of face-to-face classes to prevent learning loss.
Hey mga bata, handa na po ba kayong pumasok sa ating classroom?
Some 38,000 schools are expected to open in August, but VP Duterte is aware that not all can instantly shift to full face-to-face classes. The education chief adds schools have 3 options during the transition period until October 31st.
They can immediately start 5 days of in-person classes. Pangalawa is yung blended mode na meron silang distance learning at meron silang in-person classes. And ang pangatlo nila is a full online classes, which was a request coming from the private sector and approved by the President for a limited time.
Duterte says the DepEd is also crafting a new directive to address classroom shortage.
There is a backlog ng classroom construction and gumagawa kami ngayon ng department order na mag-streamline ng requests ng construction ng classroom.
And since we're still in the middle of COVID-19 pandemic, the Vice President says health protocols will be observed but there will be no discrimination against the unvaccinated.
There should be no segregation and discrimination for the unvaccinated learners dahil hindi naman po mandatory ang vaccination program natin. We don't see any problem with commingling sa loob ng mga eskwelahan dahil paglabas naman po nila sa eskwelahan ay naka-commingling po lahat ng vaccinated and unvaccinated natin sa mga bahay, sa mga malls, sa mga simbahan, sa public transportation.
VP Duterte adds the DepEd order on the resumption of in-person classes will be applied regardless of the alert level status. The Vice President says that the review of the K-12 program is now underway, but she did not give any timeline on the results of their review or possible recommendations. Tres Tanudalo, CNN Philippines.
Most Filipinos were satisfied with the performance of former President Rodrigo Duterte. A survey by the social weather stations finds Duterte kept his satisfaction rating at what he calls a very good level 2 months before he bowed out of office. He earned a 5-point increase at 65 compared to the last quarter of 2021. 78% of respondents said they were satisfied with Duterte's performance, a 3-point rise from December last year. 13% were dissatisfied, 9% were undecided. The survey was conducted among 1,440 adults nationwide from April 19 to 27. Up next on Newsnight, the Bangko Sentral hikes interest rates as consumers grapple with rising prices, and PBA player Paul Desiderio denies abusing his former partner. We go above and beyond with sports journalist Siege Nantenko, only here on CNN Philippines.
RPN DXKP Pagadian, ang inyong Radyo Ronda. RPN Radio Philippines Network. Radio Philippines Network. Live to the world, pinaagi sa FB page, karon mag-download na. Pinaagi sa Google Play og Apple Store, YouTube og Twitter. Alang sa mas kipakuskan nga mga balita, komentaryo, kasayuran og kalingawan. Ang mas kipakuskan nga inyong Radyo Ronda. Member, kapisanan ng mga broadcaster ng Pilipinas.
Welcome back. A surprise move from the Bangko Sentral. The Monetary Board has raised borrowing rates by 3/4 of a point in a bid to arrest the spike in consumer prices, which rose to a near 4-year high in June. The hike was unscheduled as the next rate-setting meeting is supposedly 5 weeks from now.
A significant further tightening of monetary policy was warranted by signs of sustained and broadening price pressures.
The move gave the peso a much-needed lift. The currency strengthened to 55 pesos and 98 centavos in midday trade before closing at 56 pesos and 15 centavos against the dollar. The United States Federal Reserve also expected to raise its benchmark interest rate by 3/4 of a point in its policy meeting this month. That's after U.S. inflation surged to 9.1% in June, the highest in more than 4 decades. This was mostly driven by a jump in gasoline prices, which were up by nearly 60% over the year. According to Moody's Analytics, the typical American household now needs to spend $493 more per month to buy the same goods and services they did in the same period last year. Well, back here at home, as ordinary Filipinos wrestle with rising prices of goods and low-paying jobs, the focus is now on President Marcos's first State of the Nation address and his plans to ease the burden on our kababayans. Senior correspondent Lois Calderon reports.
As inflation bites, Even middle-income consumers are cutting back on spending. Worker Katelyn Bailon says staples like food and bills take priority.
Yung question for outing, bakasyon, siguro hindi muna for this year, masyadong masakit sa bulsa lalo na nagmahal na rin pati yung pamasahe.
Kate is a classic example of Filipinos complaining of runaway food and gas prices. A Pulse Asia survey listed inflation as Filipinos' #1 worry. Ensuring there's food on the table was on top of the agenda during last week's meeting of President Bongbong Marcos with his economic team. The government is tightening its belts with a fiscal consolidation plan, but it stretches its budget for food producers themselves, the farmers and fisherfolk, especially as Marcos heads the Agriculture Department.
In our discussion on the budget, it was made clear by our president that agriculture should receive greater attention. Ensuring food security is one of those, and actually the top one.
So the economic team's job is a delicate balancing act.
We want to subsidize everyone, but this is simply not doable. If we behave irresponsibly, going beyond our limits, our spending limits, then we will compromise that future.
While the poor get subsidies, will the middle class get help too during these hard times?
The economic program that we are putting in place is one that will get us back to this high growth trajectory of, and we're talking about 6.5% to 8% growth for the duration of this administration, aiming that poverty is down to single digit, at least 9%. With the expansion of the economic pie and poverty decreasing, it's for sure that the middle class will continue to prosper in the coming years.
During his sauna, President Marcos is expected to unveil what the economic team has charted as a battle plan versus inflation. Lois Calderon, CNN, Philippines.
The Philippines' ranking in the 2022 Global Gender Gap Index has gone down as the number of women in the labor force declined during the pandemic. The World Economic Forum report places the Philippines in the 19th spot out of 146 countries. That is 2 notches lower from last year. Still, the Philippines had the second highest ranking in East Asia and the Pacific after New Zealand, which placed 4th. An earlier report by the Asian Development Bank also revealed youth and women in the Philippines lost jobs in greater numbers at the height of the health crisis. The health department in the Calabarzon region is looking to reopen national temporary treatment and monitoring facilities as it braces for a potential increase in COVID-19 cases. These facilities, located in Batangas province and the cities of Cabuyao and Calamba in Laguna, were also used as quarantine and isolation facilities during previous surges. Calabarzon recorded almost 170 COVID cases on Wednesday alone.
If the increasing trend continues, we will be developing a surplus of admissions compared to our capacity very soon. As soon as August of this year, it has been estimated that in less than 4 weeks, we might be filling up our hospital beds to capacity. Yes, because of COVID admissions, combined with the regular non-COVID cases, of course.
The DOH medical officer says there is no need to impose a definite allocation of COVID-19 beds in hospitals yet, but they will ask the health facilities when the need arises. A former health chief weighs in on when the country could lift the mandatory wearing of face masks. Iloilo representative and former DOH Secretary Janet Garin says this could be done when at least 70% of eligible recipients have been boosted. Garin says the government could encourage more people to get their boosters by subsidizing transportation costs to vaccination centers.
If you have 70% of the population boosted, you can see that the possibility of having severe cases is very low. Kasi ando dun kasi mako-cover mo yung population. Maproprotectionan mo na rin. It's the protection, the scope is wide enough to cover those who are actually vulnerable.
Pagadian also joins calls to change the definition of fully vaccinated to include those who have received a COVID-19 booster shot. So far, only 21% of those inoculated have received their first boosters. Overseas, a fourth COVID-19 vaccine may soon be available in the U.S. Regulators have authorized the emergency use of the Novavax vaccine. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention is expected to recommend it as soon as possible. Novavax is different from other vaccines with a broad immune system response to the highly infectious BA.5 Omicron subvariant. Over in China, fears of another mass lockdown in Shanghai as millions of residents undergo COVID-19 tests. City officials ordered mandatory testing in most of the 16 districts following the detection of the new BA.5.2.1 subvariant. Coming up on Newsnight, we dive deeper into the issue of domestic abuse claims when it comes to PBA athletes with sports writer Siege Tantenko. Plus, after his failed bid to get drafted into the NBA, a renowned sports agency takes interest in Filipino cager Kai Soto. More when we return.
Tumagal tayo sa dilim, laman tayo ng nightlife.
RPN DXKP Pagadian. Ang inyong Radyo Ronda RPN. RPN Radio Philippines Network. Radio Philippines Network. Live to the world pinaagi sa FB page karon. Mag-download na pinaagi sa Google Play og Apple Store, YouTube og Twitter. Alang sa mas kipakuskan nga mga balita, komentaryo, kasayuran og kalingawan. Ang mas kipakuskan nga inyong Radyo Ronda.
Member, kapisanan ng mga broadcaster ng Pilipinas.
This is CNN Philippines shortly after the former fiancé of Paul Desiderio accused the PBA player of physical and emotional abuse. Netizens began talking about the string of domestic violence claims against other players in the league. But what really happens after these allegations are heard? In a statement today, Desiderio denied abusing Agatha Uvero. We now go above and beyond the headlines with sports journalist and award-winning writer Siege Tantenko. Hi, Siege. Thank you very much for being with us tonight. Well, let's begin with this. No, let's begin with the Blackwater statements. So they had one yesterday, and they had one today, which was, a 180-degree turnaround from yesterday's statement. What do you make of those statements?
Hi, Pia. Thank you very much for having me. The first statement was met with much criticism from the public because of what it appeared to say about Blackwater's initial priorities. The initial statement said that they, quote, abhor violence against women, and yet the language seemed to protect the alleged perpetrator. To quote, it said, if the allegations are true and if the player consents, then we will look into it. And it raised questions among the public, such as, should an investigation really require the consent of the alleged perpetrator? Should the allegations be proven by an outside party before the team takes action? Perhaps then, it's not surprising that Blackwater released a second statement which changed their stance to say that they will cooperate with any investigation.
See, just go back to the first statement when they talk about, sabi nga, no, like you said, like you quoted, if the allegations were true and the concerned player consents. Was it like that in PBA? Tinatanong yung player or yung concerned athlete kung pwede ba siyang investigahan? Hindi naman ganun, ano?
I cannot speak to the consistency of a standard policy that the PBA has because there seems to have not been much transparency in regards to how these cases are handled. Most of the time what we hear is an initial, we do not condone violence statement, and then the news dies down.
But yesterday's PBA statement was, much clearer, for lack of a better description, than Blackwater's first statement, right? They did say they would investigate.
Yes, actually, in the past, in the case of Calvin Abueva in 2019, there was also said to be an investigation based on the statement. At the time, his team said that his fate in the league, because he was suspended at the time, would depend on the outcome of the case. However, it appears that the case of the wife was either dropped or not filed or not pursued. And eventually, Calvin returned to the PBA and is currently a headline player for one of the teams there.
And just recently, there was that incident concerning him on the court in one of those games. But we'll talk more about the other PBA athletes or PBA players' cases. I want to ask about this. So today, meron ng statement si Paul Desiderio, and he said, and I quote, "I vehemently deny her allegations of abuse." And I also quote, "I will fully cooperate with the PBA in the conduct of its investigation." And he also says, "I will also face any complaint against me in any forum, especially in relation to domestic abuse accusations." Your thoughts?
Well, I hope it is sincere. Certainly, these kinds of cases are very delicate and must be taken with the due respect, due consideration, and due process, of course. So I am hopeful that the investigation will proceed, and whatever the outcomes are, I hope that we as an industry learn from it and take this as seriously as we can.
Talk about victim shaming, Siege. Yesterday, when Agatha Uvero first made those revelations on social media, a part of the reaction was victim shaming, no? Blaming her, it was her fault, ikaw kasi, etc. No? Merong mga sinasabi. There was even this supposed Instagram story of a supposed relative of Mr. Desiderios that went after Agatha in so many words. How are we supposed to look at this kind of a reaction? Yung victim shaming, yung biktima ang may problema.
Well, Pia, to give you context on my field of work, I specifically deal in the space of gender as it pertains to sports, so the intersection of sports and gender. And what we see is that women face different kinds of stigma whenever they speak out against violence against women. We see this in greater society, not just in sports. When a woman speaks out about leaving an abusive relationship, she's often criticized for lacking patience, for not trying hard, and for leaving when your marriage vows say till death do us part. But then when a woman endures for a very long time and then eventually leaves, she's also criticized for leaving and being told that, oh, why did you stay if you knew it was bad? So this kind of stigmatization of victims is a factor that we need to consider, because when you look at the data, all of the research points to the fact that a survivor's willingness to report violence and pursue legal action is undermined by societal and structural barriers such as stigma, shame, and a distrust of institutions. For example, if they have seen that similar cases did not prosper or their perpetrators were not met with adequate accountability, it disincentivizes women from speaking out in the future. And this is why concrete action needs to be baked in into the league and into the individual teams and into society in general.
We'll go back to that point of concrete action, what concrete action and policy we're talking about in just a bit. But I wanted to go first to these different cases. You already mentioned one other player earlier. Let's syempre ang tanong dito, hindi naman ito isolated case. There were others. So can we discuss that for a bit?
Yes, Pia. We've learned about many individual cases over the years, but it's time that we look at them not as isolated cases, but as a symptom of a larger problem within our sports industry. Because, like you said, this is not just about the allegations against Paul Desiderio. Earlier this year, there was an allegation against Bo Belga made by his wife, alleging abandonment, abuse, and withholding of child support, which is considered financial abuse. Last year, 2021, Gio Halalon was accused by his wife, Christina, of infidelity and what she called, quote, physical, mental, and emotional abuse. The year before that, Calvin Abueva, who I mentioned earlier, his wife took to social media and uploaded CCTV footage alleging abuse against herself and their children. And in 2018, Mac Cardona was arrested after stabbing his former live-in partner after she refused to get back into a relationship with him. So there have been public statements about this in the past, but ultimately, all of these players are still playing in the PBA, except for Mac Cardona, who has gone on to have a career in the MPBL. And this is not a new story. For older PBA fans, they might remember the retired player Paul Bong Alvarez, who was arrested in 2007 for assaulting his then wife, and later he was arrested again in 2017 for assaulting his girlfriend. So what we're seeing here is a pattern of behavior enabled by a culture and by structures within the sports industry that silence and sideline women's voices and concerns.
Nagkataon pa, we had this 2.5 year, 2 year lockdown. So, and this is like the world over. If you have an abusive situation at home, it gets worse in a lockdown because you are locked in that home, right? Together.
Yes, absolutely. This is supported by data from United Nations Women, and they show us that first, that gender-based violence is on the rise during lockdown because women spend more time with their abusers. There is no break time in which you go to work or your partner goes to work. You are at home 24/7. And furthermore, the data shows us that a key factor in this abuse is the exploitation of power imbalance within relationships. So, for example, studies done in America have shown that in domestic violence cases involving professional athletes, factors include the disproportionate amount of wealth, power, and fame.
Well, let's go back to the Philippine setting. So kanina pinag-uusapan natin, hindi naman ito mga isolated cases. So can we say the opposite, that these are interconnected cases and that they have to do with a certain kind of culture, meaning the PBA culture or the sports industry culture, and corollary to that, what can you do? What can we women who are in the PBA do? What have you already done? What are those little steps that you've taken to heal these issues in that culture?
Well, it is a problem that is common in all male-dominated spaces, not just in our industry, but also in corporate settings that are male-dominated, in academic institutions that are male-dominated. There is a propensity for this kind of pattern to emerge. And in my limited capacity as a consultant for some PBA teams, I have encouraged my team to consider award-winning female athletes as their PBA muses, the hope being that we can present a more holistic image of what women in sports can be. However, this, again, is very limited, and real change really is only going to be possible through structural change, meaning changes in policies and their consistent implementation. So I want to take this, Pia, to an example in the NFL, because this shows us precedent. After a viral video in 2014, which showed the star player of the Ravens, that's Ray Rice, hitting his fiancée, the NFL has actually instituted preemptive training programs for players as well as team employees, and they've enforced stricter penalties against abusers. The team in question, Ravens, they also now have a policy to avoid drafting players with a history of abuse, and they've made donations to nonprofits that support survivors of violence. Granted, there are still questions in the NFL about the consistent application of such policies, but it gives us a roadmap. It gives us a blueprint for what we can follow in the Philippines. So if you want to ask me about something concrete we can do, every year there is a PBA player development seminar. Perhaps we can make gender-based violence and violence against women a topic for discussion there. Change really starts with accepting that our reality is not fixed and progress is possible. We need to get more women's voices in the room, but I would also like to add that we need the men to stand with us. It's important, like you said, women in my position, we do what we can, but ultimately, if we want to see change, equality takes all of us. Progress takes all of us. And so we need the men in our industry to stand with us, side by side, pushing with equal force. And so I would just, I guess, like to say as well that coming forward with one's allegations is incredibly difficult for any survivor, and it is a courageous decision. At the end of the day, we should be working towards an environment that encourages survivors, not just in sports, but in society as general. Encourage them to come forward. Encourage them that there will be support, there will be accountability, and through this, we can discourage and prevent violence in the first place.
Well, thank you for joining us and adding your voice to the, those other voices. Sports journalist Siege Tantenko, maraming salamat. On to a Filipino cager overseas, a major career mover, Kai Soto, now under the same agency as NBA stars Russell Westbrook and Klay Thompson. Soto signed with Wasserman, a company based in Los Angeles in the U.S. The towering 20-year-old was previously under agent Joel Bell, who helped him land a spot in Australia's National Basketball League. And that is it for now. Join me again on News.ph at 7 p.m. I'm Pio Ontiveros for Newsnight, where we go above and beyond the headlines.
This program is brought to you by...
There is a looming global food crisis, or it's already upon us, helped along in no small measure by a pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And the question is not when will it rear its ugly head, but what are we doing to prepare to meet it head on? Food security is, after all, equal to national security, and the Marcos administration seems to understand that, given that the president-elect is handling the agriculture portfolio himself for the time being. Because how do you make sure that food is both accessible and affordable to all so that hunger doesn't turn into anger?
I think that the problem is severe enough that I have decided to take on the portfolio of Secretary of Agriculture, at least for now. And at least until we can reorganize the Department of Agriculture in the way that it will make it ready for the next years to come.
Good evening, I'm Pio Ontiveros. Welcome to your weekly political appointment fix, politics as usual. Our first guest joining us via Zoom is a lecturer from the Ateneo de Manila University Economics Department, Carlo Fermin Adriano. Carlo, good evening, and thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Good evening, Pia.
Yes, well, let's begin
Pia.
with this.
Thank you for having me here.
Yes, so this is do we say that this is a looming food crisis, or is it really already upon us?
It's already upon us. It's already here, and if I can just share my
yes, please
my
do
data.
so. Yes, and you're going to discuss three main points with us, tonight, Carlo, and very
Yes.
quickly. What is the problem, the causes of the problem, and recommendations? So let's begin
Yes.
with what is the problem? Can you define it for us?
So first, we have to separate the short-term problem and the long-term problem. So for the short term, which is the immediate, there is a global food crisis right now, wherein the food price index of is higher than when you compare it during the 2008 and 2011-12 food crisis. Sorry, but I cannot share my screen.
No, we're going to take care of that. You can go ahead with the points you want to make, and we're going to be showing your PowerPoint.
Yeah, and then if you take a look at meat prices, even all of the agricultural commodities, they're going up, and they're higher than the 2008, 11, 12 years, wherein we have global food crisis during those period. And then the long-term problem is really the underdevelopment of the agriculture, fishery, and forestry sector. And because of this underdevelopment, we have low productivity, and this have two major socio-economic impacts, negative socio-economic impacts. One is the high poverty incidence in the agriculture households, and the other one is soaring domestic food prices.
All right. You're referring to the screen, the particular slide, which is entitled The Underdevelopment of the AFF. AFF meaning, of course, agriculture, forestry, and fishery, contributing to high domestic food prices. And the average share of food and non-alcoholic beverages to inflation is 43% from year
Yes.
2000 to 2021. And if you look at the years, so year 2000 to 2021, 22 years in the making na ito. So this is not like it just surprised us now. It just turned the corner and biglang nandyan. This has been going on. This is a problem that has been in the making for more than 2 decades.
Yes, that's correct. Again, 43%, and let me point it out that food and non-alcoholic beverages is just one out of the 11 baskets in the computation of inflation. Just take note, only one, and its contribution is already 43%.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, earlier you were referring to this agriculture, forestry, and fishing sector as growing by only 2.5%. And its contribution to GDP was only 0.3%. Again, within that same time period, 2001 to 2021.
Yes. Basically, if you take a look at the average growth rates of the three major sectors, these three sectors are the agriculture, industry, and service. For AFF, it only grew by 2.5%. Compare that to industry, which grew by 4.5%, and service at 5.5%. Now, if you take a look at the average GDP growth from given the same period, the economy grew by around 4.8%, and agriculture's contribution to that growth is only 0.3 percentage points. So it's very low.
All right. And then may low productivity pa, no? So serving as a double whammy to agricultural workers, low wages, high poverty incidence, all these factors coming into play. And I just want to, let the control know na pakita lang na po natin yung first 4 slides ng PowerPoint presentation ni Dr. Adriano. Anyway, so ito yung problema natin, and food prices expected to increase, no, given this global food crisis. Can you talk more about that?
So basically, the global food crisis is due to external shocks. Number one, COVID-19 pandemic, wherein there were disruption in logistics and trade. But basically, we're recovering from that already. And number two is because of this Ukraine and Russia war. Now, why is this important? Because Russia is the third world's largest oil producer. Russia and Ukraine account for 25% of global wheat export, and wheat is an important ingredient for animal feeds, which we feed for our livestock, poultry, and even our fish. And the third one is that Russia is the world's largest exporter of fertilizers. And we all know when we grow crops, we use fertilizers.
Okay. Of course, sorry. Of course, this Russian invasion of Ukraine began in February, but the effects are devastating. However, we are aware of what has been going on even before that. I mean, yung presyo halimbawa, no, ng what is it, wheat, no?
Yes.
It was going up like 2 years before that. That's because of the pandemic already.
Yes, due to pandemic, and actually not just wheat and corn. Corn and wheat are the major inputs for your animal feed. And why did it go up, especially corn? Because basically China bought everything. They stockpiled basically due to the African swine fever, and they wanted to basically counter the effects of ASF, and therefore they need a lot of inputs for their animal feed industry. So they stockpiled.
Okay. And of course, the effects of all of this is that nutritious food is not as affordable and not as accessible for Filipino families in general.
Yes.
Okay. Can we talk about Philippine fertilizer? It's been growing, prices have been growing by almost 100% beginning in 2019. And lately, this has affected the farmers so badly, and therefore, domino effect again. Mataas masyado ang presyo ng fertilizer. Therefore, farmers cannot plant as much as they would like, right?
Yes, basically they cannot use, there will be less application of fertilizer, and we apply less of fertilizer that will have repercussion to our production. Just like, for instance, there's a study of field rice that given the high prices of fertilizer, our rice production is projected to decline by 1 million metric tons for this year. That's 6% of our total production.
All right, 1 million metric tons. Siyempre nakakatakot yung 1 million metric tons, but ano yung effect nun on our dinner tables? No, that means that more families will grow hungry.
Not necessarily, yes, because of high prices. Basically, if we take a look at economics, the less supply, the higher the prices.
Okay. And sometimes ang nangyayari sa mga poor families, Carl, di ba, kunyari, bibili lang ng 1 kilo, 2 kilo, so baka mas kaunti pa or bibili ng 1 kilo and then they'll stretch it out for the entire day or 2 days.
Actually, there's a study from PIDS, Philippine Institute of Development Studies, about coping mechanism of farmers due to high prices of food. And one of those, basically, how they cope with high prices, they buy cheaper food. The other is basically, the other repercussion is, like, for instance, they mentioned that hindi nila pinapapasok yung kanilang children to school because they don't have enough money and they don't have enough money for the allowance of their children. And another thing is, another coping mechanism, which is very sad as well, is yung healthcare nila. Na instead of going to the doctor because masyadong namahal yung food prices, they just tend to have self-medication na lang. So those have repercussion to basically the what we call human capital development of Filipinos, especially the young Filipinos.
There are other causes of this problem, Carl, that you've been pointing out, and they are not very well known, but napakalaking ng epekto nito. Very quickly, talk to us about this rice-centric budget. So, halimbawa, di ba, we have a problem already, baka minus 1 million metric tons na. Tapos, small land size, a hectare per farmer. At saka yung isa pa, yung inadequate attention sa climate resiliency. How is this a cause of the problem?
Number one, basically, if you take a look at the budget of the banner programs of the DA, around 50% of that budget goes to rice. And we have many crops in the agriculture. We have corn, we have high-value crops. There are many high-value crops. We also have livestock and poultry. 50% of the budget already goes to rice. This budget does not include the budget of the National Irrigation Administration, which has a budget of around 45 billion. And 80% of that 45 billion, so around 36 billion, also goes to rice, to provide irrigation for rice farmers. There's also the Rice Competitive Enhancement Fund, minimum of 10 billion pesos, also goes to rice farmers. And if you take also a look at the Philippine Crop Insurance Corporation, most of their coverage is going to the rice farmers. So we neglected the other non-rice commodities. And therefore, hindi natin na-develop ito. Especially, for instance, yung livestock and poultry natin. And then, if you take a look at the contribution of the agricultural commodities to the AFF growth, ang main contributors natin before the pandemic were the non-crop commodities. It's not rice. We put everything to rice, and if you take a look at the presentation that I gave you, rice ranked last in terms of contribution to AFF growth. So if you just take a look in terms of contribution to AFF growth, we should put our money on the non-crop, which is basically livestock, poultry, and fishery, and not actually rice.
Okay. Yes. Go ahead, Carl.
And then for the small land size, basically the problem here is because of the relatively small land size, which is around 1 hectare only, mababa yung ating productivity because we cannot achieve economies of scale. Like, for instance, yung mga farm mechanization program, you won't be able to use it efficiently if it's only for less than 1 hectare of land. And even yung use of other technologies, if you're only going to use it for less than 1 hectare land, you won't use it at all. Hindi talaga, walang return on investment. So we have to increase our average land size. And then the other point that you mentioned is the inadequate attention on climate resiliency. Now, the Philippines is considered as one of the most vulnerable to climate change. And to give you an example, ang estimated damages to AFF due to typhoons and calamities is around 25 billion annually. And yet, yung ating Climate Resilient Agriculture Office of the DA has not yet been institutionalized. And if you take a look at our agriculture insurance and even our irrigation system, both will help with mitigating the effects of climate change, are also underdeveloped. And most of them goes to the rice sector as well. So those are one of the problems with the AFF sector.
Okay. Well, Carl, Adriano, as you were discussing already, marami ka ng mga, hints about what recommendations would you make. But very quickly lang, President-elect Marcos has said he's going to be handling the agriculture portfolio. Does that send a good signal? What do you think of that? And is that going to help us handle this food crisis, or, take the bull by the horns in so many words?
Yes, it's a good sign, because basically he recognizes the importance of the agriculture sector, and he recognizes the gravity of the problem that the agriculture sector is facing. Now, for the recommendation, in the short term, basically for 2022, given that we cannot do anything with the budgets, it's already there, we really need to import. Unfortunately, or fortunately for others, we really need to import so that we can manage the food inflation. And we can only do that if we can temporarily reduce the tariff rates of the key agriculture commodities. Second is we can seek bilateral agreements with other countries, like for example India. They produce some fertilizer as well. So mag-bilateral agreements na tayo with them. We discuss with them internally. Those are for the short term.
All right. Carl,
the long term,
yes.
Next time.
Yes, the long term for a longer time.
Yes.
Next time. Carl Adriano, many thanks. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. Salamat sa'yo. We'll be back after a quick break. Stay tuned.
We are not setting aside the military component of national security, the ones which we are used to talking about, but I think we should bring it nearer to the individual, because at bottom, national security is your security as an individual. These are all the things that affect the daily acts of living. Hindi ba yun ang katiwasayan ng kalooban mo? Of course, matiwasay ang kalooban mo na walang gera mangyayari dyan sa contested South China Sea. But this is so distant from your day-to-day life. I'm not saying it's not important, but what is most important is your life, everyday life. And that is the component of human security.
Well, as Clarita Carlos was saying, your life, your everyday life, and she is talking about food security. Let's continue this discussion on the looming, as Carl Adriano was saying, it's not a looming food crisis. It is here with us now with our second guest, agricultural economist Roel Briones. Hi, Roel. Good evening, and thank you very much for joining us. So it is, you agree with that, no? It is the food crisis is already upon us. Hindi ito looming crisis. It's here.
Yes, good evening, Pia. Of course, it is already here, and we're already feeling it. In fact, aside from all of these developments in Ukraine, even from last 2 years, the meat supply of the country has suffered dramatic loss from another source, the African swine fever, which Professor Carl Adriano already mentioned.
Okay, so you would say, how would you, Roel, define the problem? Can we take the bull by the horns and define? Can you define it for us?
Of course, this is basically the problem of a poor country, right? So in the final analysis, the country suffers from perennial shocks to its food security because it is poor. If you look at a country like Singapore, with almost no local production, but because of its wealth and its income, it is rated by the Economist Intelligence Unit as the most food secure country in the world. So in the long run, the solution to this is to have, for the average Filipino, to have sufficient purchasing power that despite these swings in food prices, somehow kakayanin ang budget. Now, we're not yet in that position, but we can certainly put in some measures that will move us towards more resilient kind of food consumption track.
And what are these measures?
Una-una yung food supply, no? So Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Is now sitting, will soon sit as Secretary of Agriculture, which is a very salutary development. I agree with most analysts about that. But remember, his father presided during his term over a green revolution that coincided with the rollout of a green revolution in rice. That was really a revolution that really made staved off all of these predictions of massive famine in the developing world, third world at the time, no? So we need something similar to that again, no? So that we can revitalize our food supplies through application of better science and technology.
That would be your recommendation already, Ruel? Or
Yes, that is
more?
that is it. No, because the problem is we are kind of fixated with short-term solutions. And that's fine, except now, unlike before, we have a much narrower fiscal space. A lot of these short-term solutions, they're very costly. Frankly speaking, no? A very subsidized price of rice, depending on the degree of subsidy and how you're administering it, could blow a hole through your budget in the order of, say, 200 plus billion, no? Depending, which we can hardly afford now. But what we can certainly afford is like boosting R&D in our agricultural sector, especially those with promising income-generating opportunities for our farmers, because ironically, our food producers are the ones who are bearing the brunt of this food insecurity. Now, of course, we tend to be distracted by the need for very short-term solutions, no? But the fact of the matter is we have postponed too long the need to undertake long-term solutions. The sooner we can do it, the better, and we'll be in a better position to face the next crisis, because it will come.
Okay, no question about that. Well, we've heard so many success stories of small farmer groups, small farmers, no, and kung ano yung mga best practices. What is it about us? Why can't we just get things together, get our act together, and really solve this once and for all? It's sad, no, like you say, this is a problem of a poor country. But we know that if we can get our act together, that we can really handle this, hindi ba?
I think one of the big problems is we have attributed much of the problem to a mistaken villain. So many of the actors think that market forces are at the root of the problem, when in fact it's not. No, market forces are actually one of the solutions out of the problem. So for instance, there's a market force that will tend towards, after decades of social justice, which I acknowledge, in terms of breaking up the large estates characterizing our countryside before. So this goes to the problem mentioned by Professor Adriana, no? But we have gone a little bit too far in terms of fragmenting, because of the combination of the land reform program plus population growth. And yet the land reform program is also freezing our land markets and making them too rigid, so that we don't allow for consolidation of land holdings. So we should unleash the power of market forces in that regard, no? Of course, within limits. So we don't need to, say, go back to 1,000 hectares, 10,000 hectares, haciendas. We can maybe raise it to, say, 20 hectares, allow more higher land ceiling than the very, very restrictive one of, say, 5 hectares. So this is the kind of solution we're referring to. Another market force that we can deploy is access to world markets. So even though all of these world market developments are forcing up world prices that we've already discussed, the major culprit for the high prices of imports is actually government. Government is the one imposing 40-50% tax that dwarfs any spike in world markets that we're seeing. So it's difficult, kind of hypocritical to complain about how unreliable world markets are, when it is our own governance which is forcing us to pay higher prices for these stuff.
Shooting ourselves in the foot, what's going to happen if we don't do all this? If we don't resolve this now, if we don't plan way in advance, what's going to happen? People are going to go hungry, right?
Well, whenever there's a crisis, yes, of course. Now, of course, the crisis will pass. Then we think, okay, maybe the problem will solve itself, and then we'll wait for the next one. We'll just muddle along as usual. So I think with the new decisive mandate, the new government might be able to make a turnaround.
All right, ayusin na natin ito. Ruel Briones, agricultural economist. Ruel, thank you very much for being with us tonight. We'll be back after a quick break. This is Politics as Usual.